So this video series is for those of you mobile developers who want to be more efficient when delivering value to your users. Those of you who want to deliver value more quickly and without having to do a lot of manual stuff. Now, while in this small series I am going to be using Xamarin, these steps are actually going to be very similar to React Native developers and native Android and native iOS. The reason why I'm using Xamarin is both because that is the tool that I use the most and because Xamarin will allow me to create both Android and iOS apps so I can show you the steps for both platforms. But if you are not a Xamarin developer, you can just speed through these steps that are Xamarin specific and, jump over to where I'm starting to use App Center, which is going to be the tool that I will use to enable continuous integration, continuous delivery. So of course, because this is going to be Xamarin, then I am going to be starting with a brand new project. So we're starting from the ground up in here. I am creating a blank forms application. This is going to work for both Android and iOS. Let's just call this DevOps example. And I'm going to click on next and click on create. Now notice that by default, this is already using Git version control. That is going to be helpful because it is going to initialize a Git repository for my code. Now, the code in here is actually not important. All we really have now is a label in some application, in some window, in some page in here. That is not important. What I want to show you is how I said that we will be able to connect this over to App Center so we can enable continuous integration. So, there are a couple of tools that we're going to be using here. The first one is going to be GitHub, but feel free to use other source control or other remote repository for your local Git repository. So if you use Bitbucket, that will work as well. I will use GitHub for this scenario. And of course, the first thing that I have to do is create the remote repository that is going to hold all of my code over in the cloud, in this case, over on GitHub. So I am going to be calling this the exact same way that is going to be DevOps example. These can be public or private. I'm just going to be making this private. It's not a very cool project. It's just an empty project. And what I want you to notice in here is that I already have App Center listed in here. It may be the case that you do not see this option. That is fine. But in case you do see this option already, feel free to select it already because that is actually going to make things a bit easier. Now I'm going to show you the entire process even if you do not see this option in here. So I won't be selecting it and instead I'm just going to be creating the repository. Of course, I am going to grab the repository's URL and I like to use a terminal to push my local repository over to the cloud. So let me just zoom in here into my terminal and cd into the project that I have just created, which, if I'm not mistaken, was created in here. Indeed, I can cd into DevOps example. And as you can see, Visual Studio in my case has already initialized the Git repository. If it wasn't initialized, I could just execute Git init. But since this has already been initialized, all I have to do is add the entire code base over to the Git repositories. So it is now being tracked. And I will just commit all of the new files as an initial commit in here. And since now everything is locally on the Git repository being correctly tracked, I can now just push everything over to my new GitHub repository. So for that, the first thing that I have to do is add the remote. So git remote add origin and just paste the URL. Origin in this case is just the most common name used for a GitHub repository. Feel free to change that naming. But now that I have this remote, I can execute git push -u. Now this -u is not necessary, but it is going to be very helpful. And just origin, which is the name of my remote, and master, which is the name of the default branch that gets created. So after just a couple of seconds, if we navigate back to GitHub, we should already see all of that code in here. Now, by now, maybe you already knew how to do all this. We haven't done anything related to mobile DevOps just yet. All we have done is pushed a brand new Xamarin Forms project over to a GitHub repository that, as I've mentioned, is going to contain both the iOS and Android applications. Now, the interesting thing and the one related to DevOps starts now. So we're going to be using App Center. This is a tool by Microsoft that makes it really easy for us mobile developers to not only implement continuous integration and continuous delivery, but also continuous testing or continuous quality, as they like to call it, and some other very neat features such as push notifications and databases and user authentication, and even things like bug tracking and event tracking, which is very helpful if you're doing some sort of product discovery, but let's just focus on the mobile DevOps part. The first thing that you will of course have to do is create a new account. Now you can navigate over to appcenter.ms and create your account with a variety of services, for example, GitHub itself or Microsoft account, an Outlook account, Hotmail account, a Gmail, Facebook. So just go ahead and create your free App Center account and you should be ready to navigate back to GitHub. Because over on GitHub, we're going to navigate over to the marketplace. And in the marketplace, we're going to be searching for App Center. And App Center is going to be listed right here. We see a couple of options for some reason, but the one that we're going to be using is this one that is verified. And I will select it. And right now I already have a plan, but you may have to select first a plan to be used with your GitHub repository. Of course, there is an entirely free plan that is going to be more than enough for this small series. So feel free to select the free App Center plan. And eventually, once you are following this configuration, you're going to see something very similar to this thing that I have right here down below. Now, this is actually the list of repositories to which App Center is going to have access to. In my case, I am only selecting certain repositories. That is actually what I recommend. Not all of your repositories are mobile applications, or not all of them are going to be connecting to App Center, so just normally click here and only select these repositories, and from this list, I am going to be able to find my new DevOps example repository. So now App Center is going to have access to this new repository. And I will be able to click on Save. That means that App Center is now going to be creating an application based on this repository. Now, as you can see, by default, we already navigated here to App Center. App Center is now going to prompt us to create those applications based on the repository that we select. Now, I have a long list of repositories in here, but of course, you will see only those to which you have granted access to App Center. So I will select this DevOps example, and I will of course select both iOS and Android and Xamarin because that is my case. In your case, maybe you're just creating an iOS or only an Android application. Maybe you're using React Native. I don't know, the processing here may be a bit different. But all we have to do in here is set the name, select the platforms. We don't even really need to worry too much about the release type right now. So I'll just click on create. And as you can see, in my case, I have the option to configure both iOS and Android. But actually, by now, those two applications, or one application if that is your case, will be ready. So if we navigate over to configure iOS, I will configure Android in just a second. We're going to be navigated here to a brand new iOS application here in App Center. As you can see, it is even already identifying the master branch that is created by default and that we've already pushed over to GitHub. App Center is going to be smart enough to identify from this project, which contains 3 projects, an Android, an iOS, and a .NET Standard library, from that solution, what project it is going to be building. Now, in the case of iOS, we have to select the solution itself, although we do see the project for iOS. For some reason, we have to select the solution in here. And notice that we can configure this to build as a debug configuration, release configuration, change the SDK version that we're using, the Xcode version that has recently been updated to 11.1, even a beta version of Xcode. But the thing that I want you to focus on right now, just to quickly enable continuous integration, is this option right here, to build this branch on every push. This option right here is the one that actually means continuous integration. enabling this option right here is what enables continuous integration, because if we set this to build manually, that is not really continuous integration. We will have to still click manually some button. But if we do select this one, automatically, as we're going to see in just a minute, builds are going to be triggered. And for now, a simulator build is more than enough. That doesn't require signing and some crazy stuff that Apple requires from us. We don't need to sign the builds then. Since we're not signing, we cannot do either of these two options, but that is okay. I will just click on Save. Just like that, I have configured continuous integration for my iOS application. As you can see, all we really had to do was navigate over to GitHub, set access to a certain repository that we already had, and set this teeny tiny configuration here in App Center. Now, in the case of Android, the process is exactly the same. In fact, notice that App Center is prompting me to now configure my Android build, because I have two projects inside of that repository, so the iOS and the Android project. So let's now navigate over to the Android application, because indeed App Center created another application only for the Android project. Notice that in this case, it does select the project instead of the entire solution, so that is slightly different. We see similar configurations. Of course, SDKs are entirely different. One is for iOS, one is for Android, but still, we have access to a long list of SDK versions. And again, we see this option in here to build a branch on every push, so continuous integration is enabled. Now, something that I forgot to mention is that I recommend that you automatically increment the version code in here, something that is going to be helpful in a later video in this small series, but just make sure that you do select this build this branch on every push option, which should be selected by default. Again, we're not signing the builds, so these options are not enabled, so just click on Save, and there it is, the configuration to enable continuous integration for both of the applications that I have has been created. Now, what exactly happened is that over on my App Center account, a couple of applications were created. So DevOps example for iOS and DevOps example for Android. So indeed, there are a couple of applications that we will have to manage in this scenario. If you're only working with Android or only working with iOS, you will only have one. But for React Native developers, Xamarin developers, we will have a couple of them, one per platform. And by the way, let me just navigate over to the iOS application and let me just zoom back a little bit so we can show these options to the left and show you that all of that configuration was done directly on the Build tab. We were automatically navigated here, but we can always go back. So here in the Build tab, we see the branches that we have and we can configure the build, and I am going to make sure that I automatically increment the build number as I did for Android as well, and save. So now that I have continuous integration set up, let me show you that that is indeed the case. So let me navigate back to GitHub, and I am going to be opening my DevOps example repository again. And I am going to be making a small change in here. In fact, let me do it directly from the IDE. I am going to be opening the main page.xaml file. And I am also going to be opening the terminal because I like to work with Git in the terminal a little bit better than with Visual Studio. So the first thing that I want to do is create a feature branch. So I don't normally work directly on the master branch. I create a feature branch where, as the name suggests, I work on a particular feature. So I am going to execute git checkout-b to create a new branch that is going to be just feature 1 or something like that. And now that I am on feature 1, of course, everything that I do over on Visual Studio will only exist inside of that branch. For example, what I can do is change the text that is being displayed inside of this label. Currently, just welcome to Xamarin Forms. Let's change this to be welcome to DevOps example. Something like that. Some very teeny tiny change, enough for our feature 1 branch to be ready. So now if I navigate back to the terminal, I can commit this change, of course, add it and add the message as well. I can do it with just this quick command and just say that this is feature 1 ready. Just this tiny quick feature. And now that I have feature 1 ready, I would want to merge it into master, but normally we want that to happen directly from GitHub, not from our local Git repository. So that is just so we can use pull requests. So what I will do is just push everything, and I don't need the U flag in this case, everything to origin from feature 1. So now the origin remote over on GitHub contains both the master and the feature 1. What I was mentioning is that I want this to happen because I want to create a pull request to merge into master. So we're going to be creating a pull request to merge feature 1 into master. I will just click on create the pull request. And as soon as the pull request is created, and let me just wait a couple of seconds here, notice two things that are happening here. One, thanks to the process that we followed of creating the applications over an App Center directly from GitHub, we see these couple of things. So it turns out that checks have been added to our pull request. Over on the checks tab, we see that we're waiting for Android build and an iOS build. So these checks are letting us know whether or not the code that is inside of feature 1 will actually build before we actually merge into master. Now, we can actually leverage this feature a little bit more, which I will probably cover a little bit later in this small series. But what I want to show you is really the continuous integration process taking place. If we navigate over to App Center and over to either of our applications and select build and select the master branch, notice that automatically a pull request build was triggered. Again, we haven't really merged into master just yet. This is just a pull request, but because we are intending to merge into this branch, a pull request build is triggered. And this is true for the iOS as well as for the Android application. So if we navigate over to the Android application, over to build and over to master, we see that build as well, automatically triggered. Now again, this is a build that was triggered when the pull request was created. But let me show you something else. Because these builds, all they do currently are acting as checks. And as you can see, one of them has been successful, and we see that information from our center updating information right here on the GitHub repository. But these checks are not really the build itself that would generate the IPA or the APK files for our projects. What would generate those files is the build that would be triggered once new code actually reaches master. Currently, the feature 1 is not yet on master. So, and by the way, notice that the two checks have now succeeded, so I can just go ahead and merge the pull request. And as soon as I merge the pull request, and I can actually delete the feature 1 branch and navigate back to App Center, notice that a different kind of build has been triggered. This is the main build, an automatic build, as it reads right here. This one, again, is triggered every single time new code reaches my branch. Not on a pull request, but after the merge or the push of the code or the commit of new code into this branch. This build right here, the one that is triggered once the merge has been completed, is the one that will generate the APK file in the case of Android and the IPA file in the case of iOS. As you can see right here, indeed, both applications have triggered the corresponding builds. So as you can see, it is very easy to enable continuous integration using App Center. Now I understand that there are a couple of things here and there that may be a little bit overwhelming. But really the purpose of this small video was to just get continuous integration enabled. Further down in this small series, we're going to talk about what these checks can do for us. How is it that we're going to be using these builds? Because currently we're just building, we're not really doing anything with the IPA or IPK. And of course, in the process, learn a little bit more about these configurations for continuous integration and eventually continuous delivery. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, leave a thumbs up, subscribe so you don't miss the future videos in this small series, and I'll see you in the next one.